Hey guys, here's our lecture on Napoleon. It's going to be kind of a long lecture, so if you have time, you want to split it into a couple of different viewings. But it's pretty much, whatever you need to know about Napoleon. And the details in here will be more of a traditional detail lecture history class. And so as far as the AP exam is concerned, they're not going to ask you to memorize everything about Napoleon. But Napoleon is a good case study that you might use on long essay. You could have a DBQ, a quote from Napoleon. So we need to see how he fits into this narrative here in chapter 28. So here we go. Napoleon, right? First and foremost, Napoleon was not French. Okay? He was born on an island in the Mediterranean called Corsica, and he lived there till about age 9, and then his parents sent him to military school in France. So he started military school at age 9, right? Around 1785, he finishes military school at age 16, and he becomes lieutenant in the artillery. Pretty young, but again, this is the 1800s, so you grow up pretty fast, or the 1700s. And so Napoleon was a lieutenant in artillery at age 16. Cannons, artillery, was kind of his thing. Throughout his generalship and his emperorship, he always relied on his cannons to get him through battles and win battles and things like that. When the revolution breaks out in 1789, Napoleon joins the revolution. Now, the thing about it is, just like French society, you have aristocrats and nobles, and once the revolution hits, those nobles are out. Sometimes they're guillotined out, but it was the same with the officer class. Most of the generals and officers in the French army had been from the noble class. Now, with the new revolutionary army, those guys are gone. You don't have rank based on family anymore. And so this gives those young officers who've been waiting for their opportunity, it gives them that opportunity. And Napoleon was one of those officers. Napoleon found himself promoted greatly in a very short amount of time because they just needed to fill those officer spots that were once filled with aristocrats, right? And so 1795, he's stationed in Paris. The National Convention, 1795 is after the Terror. So Robespierre's dead, Marat, Danton is dead. The Girondists, the Conservative Party, has taken over the government, but they are still a revolutionary party. And there's a threat from these royalists who want to come and put the king back on the throne. And so the message comes to the National Convention that the royalists are on their way. They're going to storm the convention hall and kill everybody in it. Napoleon, who was in charge of the defense of Paris at the time, is ordered by the convention to stop them. So he goes, he gets some soldiers together, he gets some cannons together, and he's able to hold off this attack. He fires into the crowd, and they run away and panic. And so he's the hero. He has saved the government. He has saved Paris, right? The savior of the republic. This kind of gets him notoriety. This gets him noticed by the people in charge. Now, the government was unstable, and there were reasons for people to be upset. And so after Napoleon wins fame, then he's appointed to something called the Directory, which is a group of, it's kind of like the Committee of Public Safety, but not as paranoid. But it's a group of people who are going to make decisions for the government without having to go through all the red tape of passing a law, and he's a part of the Directory. Now, as a military man, he is sent to fight the Austrians in northern Italy. Austria, as an empire, covers northern Italy at the time, and so he's in northern Italy fighting the Austrians. He defeats the Austrians in a number of battles and makes himself even more famous. One of the famous events that happened during this period of time is Napoleon crosses the Alps in order to get to the Austrians in northern Italy, just like Hannibal did in the Roman Empire. And so that kind of sort of was his claim to fame as well, that he crossed the Alps. Okay. Get this to move here. There we go. Okay, so here's the painting of Napoleon crossing the Alps. We'll put this online so you can see it. But if you look at the bottom corner here, there's Bonaparte's name sketched in this rock. And below, if you look really close, it's Hannibal's name. But Hannibal's name is faded because it's been a long time since Hannibal's been there. And so you have this conquering pose of the guy on the horse, and the horse is rearing, and he's taking off up the mountains into the Alps. Now, side story. The painter of this painting, Jacques-Louis David. Right? And we talked about David and how David was the revolutionary who voted for the death of the king and eventually painted Marat and things like that. So the question you have now is, how did our little revolutionary become the official court painter of Napoleon? Well, briefly, after the Terror is over, Jacques Louis David is one of the conspirators who are arrested. He's thrown in jail, and his life is in the balance for a while. But the idea, the very fact that he had the talent to paint, helps him out. He gets out of prison. He begins his business again as a painter. He paints all kinds of people. He develops a reputation as a fine painter, and then Napoleon hires him to be the royal painter of the Napoleonic Empire, right? And so he goes from being the revolutionary painter to the royal painter. A little bit hypocritical, but he stayed alive, right? Okay, now, Napoleon wanted to defeat the Austrians, but another enemy that France had was Britain, right? And he wanted to hurt the British. He wasn't strong enough to invade Britain at the time, but he felt that he could disrupt their trade with India. And his goal was to conquer Egypt. So Napoleon goes to Egypt. He fights a battle known as the Battle of the Pyramids with some Mamluk forces, those Muslim forces, his modern weapons and new strategies to sweep away the Mamluk forces, and he's able to take control of Egypt. So his plan now is just to disrupt that trade between England and India that goes through Egypt. Now, he also took a number of archaeologists with him to Egypt. So after the battle's over and after he has taken over the country, then he sends those archaeologists around to find, search through pyramids and search through tombs. He finds mummies and all that stuff. He's very interested in Egypt, really as kind of a connection or a legacy thing. He knows how powerful the pharaohs were, and he kind of sort of likes that idea of power. One of the most famous discoveries that has happened during the Napoleonic occupation of Egypt is that French archaeologists discovered the Rosetta Stone. And the Rosetta Stone, if you remember from last year, is the stone that has allowed us to learn how to translate Egyptian hieroglyphics, right? And so that's found while Napoleon was there. But things don't go well. Once he wins Egypt, then he has problems, and the problems are in the form of the British Navy. The British Navy comes into the Mediterranean, discovers the French fleet in port, and sinks it, right? So now Napoleon is stranded with his army in Egypt. He has no way to get back. On top of that, the army is suffering from disease, right? Plague, and many of them start to die. Napoleon sees that Egypt is a lost cause at this point. His plan to disrupt British trade is not going to work because the British Navy is too strong. So Napoleon makes the decision to abandon his army and go back to Paris, right? And so this is an event in Napoleon's life that a lot of historians have criticized him, abandoning his soldiers. But Napoleon saw the big picture. The big picture was he needed to rule over France. Also, during this period of time, he censored stories coming out of Egypt to make sure in the French papers, it was all positive news and not any negative news about his defeat by the British Navy or his army being in disarray because of disease, right? Let's take a look at some pictures here. We have 3 pictures. This one is the Battle of the Pyramids, and again, of course, it's done kind of romantically, so the person who painted it wasn't there. This one is Napoleon's discovery of a mummy as his handlers open the case, and he stares at the mummy as if to see if there's any metaphysical connection between he and the past. And here we have kind of a apocryphal setting where Napoleon is in the hospital in Egypt, and he's visiting sick troops because he's so concerned about them. He's about to leave and go home, leave them there, right? And so that's the Napoleon that he wants you to see. Okay, now back in France, the situation had not improved as far as the economy or the stability of the government. And so in 1799, the Directory that Napoleon was a part of had lost confidence with the French people. The French people did not trust it anymore. And so many people, seeing Napoleon as a hero in battle, it's like maybe you can be a hero of government as well. So they urge him to take over the government. Napoleon and his wife Josephine. Josephine was an aristocrat that he had married. Josephine's family thought that that Napoleon was below her, and Napoleon's family didn't like Josephine either. But she used her connections, and he used the army to take over the government. November 1799, Napoleon becomes commander of all French forces. The very next day, he liquidates the convention as far as he walks in and says, leave or be shot. And they leave, right? And he establishes a 3-member council with him as the head. And eventually those other 2 members disappear, and he becomes the sole ruler of France with dictatorial powers. He takes control of the government, right? So not an emperor yet, but this is his coup d'etat. Coup d'etat is the French word for overthrow or to change things, to blow things up, right? Okay, come on. There we go. So this is a painting of Josephine and Napoleon. Josephine on the left, Napoleon on the right. They were a couple, and by all intents and purposes, I think they did love each other. They were a very good partnership. Eventually, to have a son, Napoleon was forced to divorce Josephine and marry a royalty of another house of Europe, and so they would have a son. And that's one of the things that some historians have measured that was one of the sadnesses of his life when he had to divorce Josephine for political reasons. Okay, so in 1800, Napoleon, and again, Napoleon understands the United States and how that works. And so Napoleon would love to have a vote in order for the people to show their support of him. So in 1800, he holds a plebiscite, or a vote of the people, right? And the people vote for him to be first consul. And so now they approve of his dictatorship. Napoleon then gets to work on fixing France, right? First of all, he has to stabilize the economy. He creates an equal tax code, which, the rich pay, the poor pay, everybody pays in this tax code. And you pay based on what you've made. He also creates a national bank, which is, of course, a page out of the early American history, the idea we had a national bank for a while as well. But it also gives him more control of the economy with a national bank, right? He reduces government corruption. He fires officials that are corrupt. He creates public schools, the lycees, government-run schools to train candidates for public office. He even writes the curriculum for some of these schools. He's like, we need educated people in France in order to run the government. Now, he has to also deal with the Catholic Church. Remember, the Catholic Church had been shut out of government and shut out of France by the Jacobins. And so now Napoleon wants to repair that relationship without giving the church too much power. So he signs a concordat, or an agreement, with Pope Pius VII, right, which stated that the French Catholic Church was the most important church in France, but it also allowed for Protestant churches to exist, and it did not give back church lands, which the government took at the beginning of the Revolution. And so what Napoleon has done is Napoleon's allowed Catholicism back in to the point where the people who enjoy being Catholic can be Catholic, but he did not give the Catholic Church any power over government, right? And finally, he writes a new constitution called the Napoleonic Code, okay, which is a uniform set of laws. Now, keep in mind, from the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen to the Napoleonic Code, we have 6 constitutions in France. This is how tumultuous and crazy things were, right? Now, the Napoleonic Code granted equality under the law. It granted, basic liberties, but then it did not allocate any power to anybody but him, right? Most of the Napoleonic Code deals with domestic issues and basic small issues, and any larger issues where it's just understood that Napoleon would control those. All right, so here's a good chart that you can look at that's helpful in understanding how each section of the country was improved by Napoleon. We have the economy, government, society, and religion. And everything we talked about is just there set up on this chart. So when I put this online, take a look at the chart. It'll organize the accomplishments of Napoleon. Okay, so Napoleon becomes emperor on December 2nd, 1804. Right? He's already dictator, so why does he need to be emperor? Well, maybe he just always wanted to be emperor for some reason. He didn't really need to. Some people have speculated, why didn't he just become a president? If he had people voting for him, he could have been president, like a George Washington almost. But no, he wanted to be emperor. And so you see this famous picture, again, painted by David, that shows him with the crown and everything. Now, he's not royalty, so he cannot claim that he's emperor because his father was emperor. And so he needs a grand gesture to show the people that he is in charge and in control. And the grand gesture is painted by David, right? This is a painting of the crowning of Napoleon. And this is how it happened. Josephine is kneeling in front of him. The Pope is there. And when the Pope brings the crown up to the throne, he doesn't place it on Napoleon's head. Napoleon takes it from the Pope and places it on his own head, right? Which shows that he has created himself. He has made himself king. Now, there's not, this of course was painted afterwards as a ceremonial. This is what it was like to be crowned Napoleon. But it's not all true. Napoleon's family is in the box here, watching all the great event happen, but they in actuality weren't there, right? Again, they did not approve of Josephine, so they didn't show up for the crowning, right? Okay, so that's what he did domestically. And it wasn't so bad, right? He took away people's liberties, and and stuff like that. But he also made France a safe and secure place to live, which, again, remember, we talked about how civilization is always that balance between people who want freedom and people who want to be safe. Napoleon made them safe, right? Now, he begins his conquest. He wants to spread out. He's not just happy being king of France. He wants to spread out and be king of more. And his first idea was the New World, right? Now, France owned a lot of land in the New World, but it was mainly there for fur trapping, and so it wasn't developed. It was just there for the fur trade to bring furs across. While the revolution was going on, in addition, there was a slave revolt in Haiti. We talked about that in class already. And so when Napoleon comes to power, he's like, man, we could really use those plantations in Haiti right now to help fund the government as well as my other conquests around Europe. And so he sends troops there to try to take back the island. As we learned in class, it fails because of the guerrilla warfare that was used by the Haitian army, as well as yellow fever, and many of the soldiers die, and Napoleon gives up on that idea. Now, he still needs money, and he still has a very large area of land that France controls in the continental United States. And so he and Jefferson get together and form a deal where he's going to sell the land to Jefferson for very cheap. So he's going to get money. Jefferson's going to expand the boundaries of the United States. Everybody wins. And so he sells this area from Louisiana all the way west to the Rocky Mountains. He sells it for $15 million total, which is a steal, right? We're talking about at least, 8 to 10 states, and he bought all that land for $15 million. So great deal for America, and we know how influential it was. And you probably know what we're talking about already. This was the Louisiana Purchase, right? So all that pink area there, that's Louisiana Purchase, and that's when Napoleon sold Jefferson. Napoleon gets his money to fight European wars, and Jefferson expands the territory of the United States. Okay, so then he turns his attention to Europe, right? He had been threatened by Europe already, by the monarchies of Europe who don't like him, and the revolution, even before Napoleon had shown up, they were enemies, right? Britain was an enemy, Spain was an enemy, Austria was an enemy, and so they're enemies anyway, so now he's going to conquer them. And so Napoleon had already annexed parts of Netherlands and Italy and Spain. Then his enemies created an alliance called the Coalition, made up of Britain, Russia, Austria, and Sweden. Okay? Now Napoleon organizes his army and is able to defeat all his allies except for Britain. Now I'm skipping over a lot of stuff here. If you're a real Napoleonic fan, then you want to study these battles like Ligny, battles like Austerlitz, those types of battles that are very very prominent, but we're not going to be able to cover those there, right? So the one battle says the Battle of Austerlitz is the big one where he defeats Russia, Prussia, and Austria, and they all signed peace treaties with Napoleon, being allies to France. And so Napoleon defeats continental Europe. Italy is in his control. Spain is under his control. The German states. Now he has to turn his attention to Britain. But what's standing in his way of invading the island of Britain is the British Navy. Okay, so here's the Battle of Austerlitz. This is a battle. He's fighting 3 or 4 different armies, and he's able to defeat 3 or 4 different armies. And his strategy was great. I mean, this is really Napoleon at his finest as far as a statistician or a strategic general. And he really is able to manipulate the battlefield and trick his enemies into coming into ambushes and things like that. And it's an all-day battle, but he wins the day, right? Okay, then we get to the Battle of Trafalgar. This is the biggest naval battle of the war. Again, Napoleon has to take care of the British Navy if he has hopes of invading the island of Britain. He and a Spanish fleet fight the British Navy off the coast of Spain. Now, one of the most famous commanders in British history was named Horatio Nelson, and Nelson was in charge of the British fleet. Now, the British fleet, of course, was outnumbered because they were fighting 2 different navies. But Horatio Nelson had a different strategy that allowed him to split the Spanish and French ships and surround them, right? Instead of, when we fought on the seas during the times of the sail, ships would sail up beside each other and just shoot at each other. It's kind of like a heavyweight boxing match where they just shoot at each other till one of the ships fell and sank into the ocean, right? Well, that was not Horatio Nelson's plan. Horatio wasn't going to go toe-to-toe with a bigger fleet. He was actually going to sail his ships and split the fleet, right? And then surround them and attack them that way. He was successful, but he also was fatally wounded and died during the battle. right? So as a martyr and a victor, he's one of the greatest heroes Britain that the British see in their pantheon of heroes, right? So the defeat at Trafalgar ended Napoleon's hopes for the invasion of Britain. He never got a chance to do that. Okay, so here's what we're talking about with Trafalgar. Take a look at this on the PowerPoint. You have the French and Spanish fleets here, and they're lined up in the traditional way, and they expect the British to line up right beside them and just kind of shoot at them until like one ship dies and one ship lives. Well, instead, you've got Nelson driving in here into the middle of these ships and eventually splitting them in two and then circling around and defeating half of the fleet instead of the full fleet, right? With this maneuver, he's able to capture like 2/3 of the enemy fleet. And also, this is advantageous because the cannons in the front of the ships have a wider target of the entire French or Spanish fleet, whereas the French and Spanish fleet are just shooting at the front of the British ships. It's a much smaller target, right? And so it worked out both ways. Very good naval commander Nelson was. All right, so Napoleon turns his attention away from Britain. They are an annoyance, but they're not going to mess up his system. But he has to take care of them because they are an economic power. So one of the things he does in 1812 is the height of his empire. He has conquered everything but Britain and Sweden, and Portugal. He hasn't conquered the Ottoman Empire either, but everything else is his in Europe, and that's a lot of stuff. And so he began to place different rulers on thrones, especially in Spain and in Italy. He began to place different rulers, and the nations of Austria, the nations of Russia were weakened allies, so they had to do everything he said, right, because of the Treaty of Austerlitz. Now, even though Napoleon ruled France as an enlightened monarch, and he passed the Napoleonic Code, which gave people equality under the law, he was very oppressive when it came to other countries and the people of other countries. There are many in Austria, many in Germany, many in the German states that would welcome this idea of revolution and equality under the law, but that was not granted to them. It was only granted to the French people, right? So the hopes that Napoleon would be a liberator from the oppressive feudal system and monarchies was lost pretty early on in the French Empire. Okay, so this is Napoleon's empire. All in the purple, of course, is France, and the areas directly controlled by France. The light purple is areas where Napoleon put a friendly king on the throne, sometimes a family member, and then this part is also allies that are closely associated and controlled by France. They're allies, but they're controlled by France. And the yellow areas are places he had not conquered. Okay, so he has to take care of the British economy, as we said before, right? And so he develops what we call the continental system, which he takes all the ports under his control and he closes them off to British trade. He refuses to let British ships in those ports, right? Thinking that he's going to hurt the British economy and Britain would eventually go broke and he would maybe invade again, right? The problem is that whenever, and we learned this in the American Revolution, whenever you pass laws that restrict trade, trade is still going to happen. It will happen legally or it will happen illegally. So smuggling became very big during this period of time in Europe because people just wanted to make money, right? So they would smuggle goods in here and there, black market goods. And so trade didn't really ever stop. It just went from legal to illegal, right? And in response to the continental system, Britain also begins patrolling areas on the Atlantic Ocean because they still control the seas. And they begin intercepting ships headed for France. Now, the issue here is many of those ships were American. So the British keep seizing American ships and seizing American cargo and even seizing American sailors to serve in the British Navy. And eventually it's going to come to a head and it will start what we in America call the War of 1812, right? Whereas at the same time the British are fighting Napoleon in Europe, they're also fighting in America because America has declared war on them because of this trade issue, right? In the end, the continental system is a failure. It doesn't hurt England much at all. It actually hurts the Napoleonic countries more than it hurts England. Okay, so Spain, the war in Spain, called the Peninsular War, because Spain is the peninsula sticking out into the Mediterranean. Now, Spain was already under French control, but Portugal was not. And so the French wanted to take Portugal as well, so they Napoleon sent huge armies through Spain into Portugal. The issue, of course, the king of Spain was cooperative, then wasn't. Napoleon had him removed and replaced with his brother Joseph, so Napoleon's brother Joseph becomes king of Spain. The Spanish people, of course, were very against this. They begin to resist, right? And there's no real Spanish army anymore, but they do have militia fighters, just like America did. So they fought this guerrilla warfare with the help of the British. The British see an opportunity here, so they send an army to Spain, and under the Duke of Wellington, which is one of the greatest British commanders in history, he helps these guerrilla fighters push the French back. So the French never able to take Portugal, and eventually they are pushed out of Spain by these guerrilla fighters and by the British. Right? Okay, so and what this does to hurt Napoleon is that he spends so much time and energy in Spain. Over 300,000 men are involved in the war, and the war fails, right? So he sucks a lot of energy out of his empire that he could have used in other places. So we're at the point in Napoleon's empire where we're talking about his mistakes, right? This is probably something I should have mentioned earlier, but the Continental System was a mistake. The Peninsular War was a mistake. He could have left that alone, right? And so at his height, Napoleon begins to make errors, and these errors will eventually cause the fall of his empire. The last error is the invasion of Russia. For some reason, Napoleon felt that he needed to invade Russia. The Tsar had signed an alliance with him at Austerlitz, and he wasn't a puppet king, but he was very friendly with France. But the Tsar he didn't stop selling goods to Britain. There was things that he did, and not deal breakers, but things that he did that annoyed Napoleon. So Napoleon decided to take Russia. Now, as you know, Russia is huge, right? And in order to take a country like that, you need a massive, massive army. This is true of Napoleon, and it's also true of Hitler, and that in the World War II. And so, also, the greatest ally the Russians ever had in warfare is the Russian winter, right? And so, keep those two things in mind as we tell the story. Now, Napoleon doesn't have enough French troops to do this, so he goes around his empire in Austria and Prussia and all these other states, and he gathers this army, and he calls it the Grand Army or the Grande Armée in French, right? So with these 500,000 troops, he invades Russia in June of 1812, okay? And so June. So he pushes toward Moscow. His objective is Moscow, and he's going to take the city and make the Tsar surrender Russia to him, and he will be the new king of Russia. Now, the Russian army does not meet Napoleon at the border and try to stop him from invading Russia. In fact, the Russian army retreats and withdraws into Russia, drawing Napoleon further and further into this large landmass, right? The people have been ordered by the Tsar to follow what we call a scorched earth policy. What that means is anything they can't carry with them while they're retreating, they burn. They kill any farm animal they can't take with them. They burn all the crops, so the French cannot live off the land. Right? So Napoleon is forced to create a supply line that goes all the way from Prussia to Moscow, which is a massive supply line. And you can imagine the problems with that. You have miscommunication. It takes a long time to do it. And this is in times that we aren't at war. Many of the Russian soldiers circle back around behind the French army and harass this supply line, right? And so it becomes more and more difficult the further Napoleon gets into Russia. Now, finally, they're about a day's march out of Moscow, and the Russian army decides to turn and fight, right? So on September 7th, 1812, you have the Battle of Borodino. Massive, massive battle with a huge La Grande Armée, and Russia also has a massive force. They fight, and a lot of historians say they fight to a draw, right? And there's no clear winner here, but the Russians do leave the field, and Napoleon stays. So if that's your measurement of victory, then Napoleon wins because the French army is still there at the end of the day, and the Russians have withdrawn. Now, the Russians don't withdraw to Moscow. They withdraw to Moscow, and then they keep going, right? So Moscow now is an open city, and Napoleon can march straight to Moscow. Objective achieved, right? Well, not really. Here's the Battle of Borodino, and again, this is kind of a painting. Enjoy it on the laptop there. You had massive cavalry fights in the Battle of Borodino with these huge groups of cavalry from Russia and the Grand Armée just clashing. It's really probably a magnificent thing to watch. Bloody, but magnificent. Okay, so Napoleon gets to Moscow, and he expects to walk into the throne room and the Tsar be sitting there on the throne. The Tsar would hand him the crown, and he would sit on the throne, and everything would be fine. He goes, and the Tsar's not there. The Tsar has left, right? And so Napoleon's like, well, he's left his capital. He has to come back to the capital. He'll eventually come back and talk peace, right? While this is going on, a fire begins in Moscow, and the city begins to burn, right? Now, we don't know whether or not the Russians set this fire on their way out of town or some drunk French soldiers set the fire. But anyway, the city is burning around him, and he's sitting in the Tsar palace waiting for the Tsar to come back. The Tsar never comes back. Napoleon waits there for 5 weeks. It is now the middle of October, and he has to decide what to do. He has soldiers in the city that don't have enough food. They don't have winter equipment, no shoes, gloves, anything like that. And he is about to get stuck in the Russian winter. So he says, maybe I should just cut bait and just leave right now. And so he decides to take the chance. He's going to gather his army, and they're going to march from Moscow all the way back to Prussia. If he's lucky, the winter will hold off, and he'll be able to get across into Prussia before the heavy snow hits. He's not lucky. Winter comes early, and by the time he's out of Moscow and well into the countryside of Russia, there's snow all over the ground. The temperature goes way below zero. Men die of exposure. Men die of hunger. Men are picked off. Stragglers are picked off by the Russian army who's come back to harass the French troops. And this is a disaster for Napoleon, right? This is the worst thing that you could possibly imagine. And so he comes in to Russia with 500,000 men. He leaves Russia with 10,000 men. So he loses all those men in his retreat from Russia. So his army is decimated. This is the worst mistake he made, right? The invasion of Russia. So here we have a painting of Napoleon, the grim-faced Napoleon leading his army out of Russia, the snow-covered roads and things like that. It was a mess. It really was. Okay, now, Napoleon gets back to Paris and tries to create a new army. Right, but he can't recreate what he'd already done because these are green troops with very little training. They're horses that aren't used to combat, and so he tries. The coalition, of course, descends on France now because they smell weakness, and so there's a battle of Leipzig, and the Battle of Leipzig is a big defeat for Napoleon. The coalition forces are able to defeat him. He retreats back into Paris. The coalition forces invade Paris. Napoleon wants to keep fighting, but his generals say, no, we're done. You don't know when you're defeated. You're defeated. And so Napoleon is forced to abdicate his throne in April 1814. Okay? So the coalition takes him into custody. They decide what to do with him. They're not going to execute him, but they were afraid that would make him a martyr. And so they send him away into exile on the island of Elba. And so he's stuck on the island of Elba. He's supposed to live there for the rest of his life. All right, now, on the throne, the coalition places the brother of Louis XVI, which we learned about as Louis XVIII, right? And he's going to be the new king. He's not very well liked. He's not familiar with the French people. He's very arrogant, of course, because he's from that Bourbon bloodline, and so the people hate him. But he's got to be there because the coalition wants him there, except in 1815, on March, and in the spring of 1815, Napoleon escapes from Elba. Right, he's under house arrest. He gets past the guards. Somebody has a boat. He takes the rowboat out into the ocean. There's a sail ship waiting for him. He takes the ship back, and he lands in France again on March 1st. And he has this huge march to the capital. That's really what it is. And as he marches, his soldiers hear about it, and the old army comes back and crowds around him. There's one marshal named Marshal Ney, who now is the head of the French military, and Marshal Ney promises King Louis that he's going to bring Napoleon back in an iron cage. There's this huge showdown where his forces meet Napoleon's forces that have collected around Napoleon, and they're lined up ready to shoot each other. And Napoleon steps in front of him and says, "Who am I? I am your emperor. Do you recognize me? I'm your emperor." And everybody just drops their guns. And so Ney actually is put in control of much of Napoleon's army because he was Napoleon's general. But you always wonder if Ney was rubbed a little wrong way because his soldiers abandoned him for Napoleon, right? And so Louis flees because he's got no support now, and Napoleon comes into France and renames himself emperor. So now he's the emperor again. All right, so now we begin what we call the Waterloo campaign, right? I think maybe Napoleon at this point would have been happy just being king of France if he would have been able to talk to the coalition forces and say, look, I've got no designs to take over anything. I just want to run the country of France. However, they weren't listening to that. And so a new coalition forms with Britain and the states of Prussia to combine together and defeat Napoleon. Napoleon always believed that offense is better than defense. And so he gets his army together and strikes out from France. And his goal is to defeat the Prussian army and the British army separately so he doesn't have to fight them together. The key is not to let them unite. And so this campaign lasts almost exactly 100 days. And sometimes in history you'll find this, the 100 Days campaign is what it's called. And so Napoleon goes out, finds the Prussian army first, fights them, defeats them, forces them to flee the battlefield of Quatre Bras, right? And and then turns to face the British. But he doesn't pursue the Prussians to make sure they all go back home to Prussia or annihilate them. So they're still out there, right? So the Prussians are able to withdraw. Now, Napoleon meets the British and some forces from the Netherlands at Waterloo. Waterloo is a city, and there's a field close to the city, and so it's called the Battle of Waterloo. The British forces have the high ground. Napoleon is forced to march up this high ground to get to the British positions, and so they begin the battle. They can't begin the battle during the morning times. It's too muddy. The field is way too muddy. It had rained a lot the night before, and also Napoleon was suffering from, I guess, hemorrhoids, right? And so he wasn't feeling very well. He was old by this time. And so the battle doesn't really get going to around lunchtime. And that hurts the French because the French really needed to get this battle going. But they push against the British line. They are able to take a little bit here, a little bit there, but then the British hold strong. There's a couple of really big cavalry charges that don't work out. And so the battle goes all day long. But in the distance, the French see clouds of smoke, right? And they think, oh, that must be reinforcements from this French general. Well, it's not. It's the Prussians. The Prussians have circled back around and are coming up on Napoleon's rear guard, right? And so Napoleon now is stuck between these two forces, and he has to get away. So he makes one last-ditch effort to break through the British line. It does not work. At that point, the Prussians slam into the French army, and the French army is in mass retreat, right? And so this is the end of Napoleon's dream to be the new king of France. And it saves Europe, right? Wellington and the Prussians save Europe from another Napoleonic campaign, right? Okay, so this is one of the most famous paintings of Battle of Waterloo. This is the charge of the Scots, right? One of the great cavalry charges. And really, because of musketry and cannon fire and things like that, we don't have too many more cavalry charges like this left in world history. And so this is one of the great ones. It really didn't do much. They actually they broke through part of the line, and they went too far and were surrounded. Many of them were killed. So it looks good on in oil, though, right? Okay. So Napoleon is captured again, right? And he said, okay, and we're going to send you to even a nastier island. The island is called St. Helena. And so he's sent to St. Helena in exile, and he lives there and eventually dies, maybe of stomach cancer. There's even some rumors that he was poisoned, slowly poisoned by the British to make sure that he would never make a comeback. And so, but eventually he dies. The peace, now we have to figure out what to do with Europe. Europe has been turned on its head because Napoleon had gotten rid of all the monarchies and changed everything. And so what do we do now that Napoleon is gone? And so all the European countries met in the city of Vienna, called the Congress of Vienna, and decided what to do about Europe. Okay? Now, here's what has happened. Democracy and revolution have come to France, and it really messed things up. Because eventually you have revolution, democracy, and equality, and eventually you have another emperor, and that emperor tries to conquer Europe. And so the leaders at the convention are like, we're done with democracy for a while. So they have a very conservative outlook on what the state of Europe should be. And here are their goals. They want to return France to its pre-revolutionary boundaries. Remember, there's no war guilt here. We're not going to make France pay for the war. We're not going to make we're going to punish them for the war. We want France back, and we want it healthy, and we want it to trade with us. It's really economic reasons here. And so they put the boundaries back at 1790 and say, okay, France, you stay there, right? And you grow we're going to put King Louis back on the throne. You're going to create a constitutional monarchy, and you're going to be France. And so there's really no punitive, France joins Europe again in a matter of a year, right? They want to restore a balance of power. Now, this is key to remember because this is going to be important in all the way up to World War II. In Europe at this point, the idea is that we cannot let one country get too powerful because that will upset the balance of power of the European countries. And so France was an example. Napoleon and France became too powerful, and so there had to be an alliance to put them down, right? And so European countries dedicate themselves to the idea that if one country becomes too strong, then other countries will ally against that country to put them back in its place. Foreshadowing, Germany, Hitler, right? Okay, so keep that in mind. Now, they also wanted to restore Europe's royal families. Again, this is a conservative idea. They want to bring back the kings and bring back the monarchs that Napoleon had kicked out. Louis XVIII was a great example. And restore, what they're looking for is stability. right? We're going to have like these revolutions and stuff, and it's just going to be chaos. Let's get stability here because we've had chaos already, and let's replace all these monarchs and put them back on the throne. Now, when we talked about the Latin American revolutions, this is one of the things that kind of rubbed the Americans the wrong way, the Latin Americans, because, now the king was back, and now they wanted to be a colony again, yeah? Okay, containment of France. Here are the details. Former Austria-Netherlands and the Dutch Republic were united to form the Kingdom of the Netherlands. They want to surround France with powerful countries so France doesn't get the idea to be, to expand again. Remember, this happened even before Napoleon. Going all the way back to Louis XIV, France was trying to push its way out of its boundaries. And so now they want to create a boundary around France to keep France in its place. They create a group of 39 German states, were loosely joined in a German confederation. Remember, the Holy Roman Empire is dead, and now we have the German Confederation, right? Different German kingdoms. And they would be dominated by Austria, who is the largest kingdom there. Switzerland was recognized as an independent nation, so there you have Switzerland in the middle of Europe. And the Kingdom of Sardinia and Italy was strengthened by the addition of Genoa. Okay, good for them. All right, now, putting the kings and queens back on the throne. France would not be punished, but they would put Louis XVIII on the throne. They would quickly create a constitutional monarchy, so it would be very similar to England in that way. The King of Spain was restored, as well as the Habsburg princes of northern Italy, right? This is also when the Portuguese king comes back from Brazil. We talked about that already, right? Many of the former rulers of the German states also regained their thrones, and Congress believed that the former monarchs would establish stability in Europe. That's what we're looking for, peace and stability. Okay, now, how is the Congress of Vienna, how does it influence European history? Well, it does greatly. It established peace for many decades. I read something that said, this is 1815, 1820. There's not another war in Europe until 1853, right? And so we do have decades of peace after the Congress of Vienna. Because of fear of the revolution, many of the monarchs would create a concert of Europe, which means that if your country has a revolution, I pledge to send my soldiers to help you, and you'll do the same to me. So many monarchs are very skittish about this idea of revolution and the Enlightenment, right? And so they're going to create an alliance system that says, I'll help you take care of your revolution if you don't take care of mine, in case it breaks out, right? Many of the wealthier classes still hope to gain power in government. And so when you're talking about when we study Marxism, we're going to talk about these guys called the bourgeoisie. And the bourgeoisie are the wealthier classes that aren't aristocrats, but they're wealthy. And they enjoyed power, especially during this tumultuous period of revolution and Napoleonic Wars. And now they want it. They've got money, they've got influence, now they want power. So we're still pushing from the bottom to get into this aristocratic government class, right? The middle and lower classes just want liberty and equality and brotherhood. And what we're going to see at the end of the chapter is the idea that what Napoleon and the Napoleonic Wars truly do is open up the idea of nationalism. Right? We are the same language, we are the same culture. Why can't we have our own state? And that's the next phase we're going into, is the idea of nationalism. Okay, so Latin America, we've covered this, right? We have the Peninsulars and the Creoles, and then we have revolutions in Haiti. Of course, that happens during the reign of Napoleon, as well as revolutions in Mexico later on. So we've covered this already. And Brazil. There's Prince Metternich, and he's the guy who was the most influential person in the Congress of Vienna. The guy who came up with the idea of the balance of power. The guy who came up with the idea of reestablishing monarchies throughout Europe. Right? Okay. And that's the last slide. So that's Napoleon, the rise and fall. Hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, of course, you know where to find me. And when we meet again, we will talk about the idea of nationalism. Okay?